My name is David Adès. I'm a poet based in Sydney and the host of a monthly poetry podcast reading series called Poets Corner in association with WestWords in Parramatta in Sydney's West. WestWords is Western Sydney's literature development organisation. Poets Corner is part of WestWords' public programming that celebrates the richness, diversity and insight that literature offers. Especially in these times, we thank the ongoing support of Create New South Wales, the Cultural Fund of Copyright Australia, City of Parramatta Council, Blacktown City Council and Campbelltown City Council, as well as the many project partners that have enabled us to continue to provide opportunities to writers and audiences. We hope that this new world will see a sharing and a closeness of spirit, despite everything that's going on around the world at the moment. We hope that. Each month I invite a poet to read poems and talk about them around a theme of the poet's choice. Our guest poet today is Tracy Ryan, who'll be reading poems and talking with me on the theme of transience, the temporary nature of things, passage of time. But first, an acknowledgement of country. I'm recording this from Beecroft in Sydney. Tracy lives and writes in southwestern Australia. I would like to pay my respects to and acknowledge the elders, past, present and emerging, of the Wallamita people, the traditional custodians of the land in Beecroft, and of the Whadjuk, Ued and Balladong peoples of the Noongar Nation, the traditional owners of the land where Tracy lives and writes, and to acknowledge also that they are the sovereign owners of their land, which has never been ceded or given up. Tracy Ryan was born in Middle Swan on the then eastern edge of Perth in 1964, grew up as part of a large family in the outer suburbs and now lives in the Western Australian wheatbelt. She has published 6 novels and 10 full-length collections of poetry, the latest of which is Rose Interior, Giramondo 2022. And she'll be reading from some poems from that book today. The Willing Eye 2000 and The Argument 2011 were awarded the Western Australian Premier's Prize for Poetry. Tracy has also been awarded the Mattara, Newcastle and the ABR Peter Porter Poetry Prizes. She has worked in libraries, bookselling, editing and journalism, and in tertiary teaching in the United Kingdom, USA, Germany and Australia. She's interested in foreign languages and translation. Hi, Tracy, and welcome to Poets Corner.
Hello. Thank you. Nice to be here.
So you've chosen this wonderful theme that we all grapple with, transience, the temporary nature of things, passage of time. Can you say something about how that theme manifests in your poetry?
Well, I think it's not always conscious. It's not that I set out to write to that theme, but if I look back over the work, which I don't do very much because I always feel like when something's written, it's for someone else to read then. But if I force myself to look back over things, I think, wow, this just keeps, and maybe it does in many ways in all poetry, keeps coming up. And I can remember from my teens on consciously thinking that poetry was a way of kind of grappling with that, dealing with that incredible. As I get older, it only goes faster. You know, time just goes faster and so much seems to be fleeting. And maybe poetry is a way of not so much arresting that, but engaging with it, you know, kind of diving into that problem, that what's here one moment is then gone. It always seems to have preoccupied me. And as I say, I think probably most poets too.
Yeah, I'm sure you're right. And you've probably preempted half a dozen of my questions, but I'll probably sort of want to tease them out a little bit further.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You say you're not really conscious of it when you're writing, but do you think that it's something that your poetry is responding to or inspired by? And you've mentioned that, you know, as you get older, it only seems to go faster. Is it something that is becoming more central to your writing as you get older?
Possibly. I think probably it was always there and always responded to in other poets that I read too. From a young age, because like many people, I was first really exposed to poetry at school, in literature classes. And a lot of the poets that we looked at, say the metaphysical poets or others like that, or somebody like Wilfred Owen, you know, they always studied Wilfred Owen in Australian schools, very much that sense of the presence of death, to sound really sort of morbid about it, but you know what I mean.
Futility.
Just from a very early age. So maybe it's something that becomes, more conscious as you get older, but it's always been there for me, actually, from a very young age, that preoccupation. But as I say, it's not that I sit down to say I'm going to write a poem about that. It's that whenever I turn over any particular topic, it seems to come back to that thought. Yeah.
I mean, it's very much part of the human condition, isn't it? And we try and avoid it with routines and rituals, with family, friends, community, with endless tasks. Our lives getting busier and busier. So you could say it's there, it's in the background, we understand it on an abstract level. But I think we often live our lives either in opposition to or in denial of the notion of transience. Are you interested in exploring the theme with perhaps greater candor than your readers might be comfortable with, or to confront it more head on? Or do you come at it slant, as Emily Dickinson would say?
I think a bit of both, probably. I think that, I've written some poetry that probably seems very personal, and part of why that is possible is because of that process of putting it aside and putting it behind me once it's written. So then it's out there. So there is a sense in which maybe I've tried to look front on at some of those things, but often it is just a slant background recognition too that that's going on. So it might be something as simple as, in one of the poems I'm going to read today, a little feather that floats into my hand for no apparent reason, and leads to thoughts about something much bigger than the feather. But or it might be actual personal losses. We've all been through them. I can only write about the ones I've experienced. I can't write about other people's losses, but hopefully people find some sort of note to relate to in what you write, even if it's from your own experience. I mean, a lot of my poetry is from my own experience, but some of it's from family experience. It's the I is not always me, although it frequently is.
Yes, readers need to be wary of the fact that the poetic eye is not always the poet.
Yes.
Writing poetry, I would argue, is perhaps the most unsupported creative endeavor there is. Do you think that the act of writing poetry and putting together poetry books that not very many people read is itself an exercise in transience?
Yes, it probably is. And so in that sense, it's a kind of defiance, isn't it? It's a way of saying I'm going to do something that may not, in the very transient world systems we live under, may not currently be considered worthwhile or worth doing. But it's a way of processing reality for me, and for a lot of other poets I know as well, that even if you took away any possibility of publication, it would still somehow be something you do, something that, and people have done that as long as people have existed too, whether it's written down and published or not, just using language in a not necessarily communicative way to process experience. So yeah, there's a kind of defiance in that, and I think it's a defiance common to all poets. And maybe it's only poets that read poetry, but then, as is often observed, people often turn to it at crucial times when that transience is evident to them. They will turn to poetry, whether that's for funerals, weddings, or momentous events. That's when they do actually acknowledge that it has a role. So but it's just something, for me, it's something I have to always have had to do, regardless of publication or not. And it seemed to me from an early age, because I read, and reading was a real refuge for me growing up, reading and writing didn't seem like separate activities. So it seemed to me as a child, if you read, you also wrote. I thought that was what people did. And for most writers, that's probably the case. That it's a logical extension. If you read a story or a poem and it does something to you, you want to extend it or prolong it or reply to it or engage with it in some way.
So how old were you when you wrote your first poem?
First poem, probably, actually, it was very mercenary. I was probably 11 or 12, and it was, I'm just trying to think. I used to send things to newspapers to try and win prizes and, little monetary prizes or little records back in the days of vinyl records. And so I probably wrote a dreadful rhyming verse about one of the Bay City Rollers, I think, when I was about 11. And I got the whatever it was I was trying to get, I got it. So I thought, oh, this actually works. And I did the same with fiction. My brother and I used to write little things and send them into the children's pages of the newspaper. So I guess we were always conscious of the idea that you could get published and you could get pocket money that way. The West Australian, believe it or not, used to do that, used to pay children for contributions. It's hard to believe now. So much has changed with newspapers and publication, but
it's still only just pocket money now, though, isn't it?
Yes, that was good training in a way. It's not usually vinyl records anymore, but no, it was really because coming from a large family, inevitably there wasn't much pocket money or much access to buying records and music as you wish to around the age of 11 or 12. And so that's how that happened. But, I mean, really jingle jangle sort of rhyming. I wouldn't call that poetry really. And I started being serious about poetry from about age 16, I think.
Mm.
So, and that was probably related to doing literature at school and just being blown away by people like Judith Wright and Wilfred Owen and John Donne and other poets. I mean, too many to name. And that's probably a very common Australian and West Australian experience, is that first real immersion in incredible poetry doing literature at school. And I was fortunate enough also to do French at school in an era when you also had to do poetry there. So we had this wonderful anthology. I should have brought in a copy to hold it up and show, that was full of French poems with little English introductions. And in those days, for the final French exams, which I didn't end up taking, but that's another story, you had to memorize certain poems. So it might be a Baudelaire or it might be a Verlaine, and recite them for your exam and then talk about the poem. It's hard to imagine now that would not now be the subject of an oral exam in language studies, but it was then. It was very much, so it was like having double literature at school in French poetry and in English language poetry, with a lot of Australian poetry in there, which was great too.
Mm. All right, you want to give us a poem?
Yes, well, the first one I chose is from my most recent book, which is this one with the yellow cover, Rose Interior, from Giramondo. And it's called Off Season. Off season. Hedges don't blossom. Sky won't turn on. Off season. Suspicion. Why would you come here? What are you after? Carry your distant summer on the inside, aligning. Loss only you register. Do I know you from somewhere? You've landed in roadworks, wrong side of the fabric, in stripping, refitting of all the old premises. Everything emptied out. Chill halitosis in somebody else's house, caress of absence. You almost prefer it like this. The village has dropped the courting. Worst ways reckoned with, well past first notions. The vision unclouded, not cushioned by green. Cheaper too this way, though you pay in blood for the warmth.
Yeah, I always wonder whether when I read these poems, how much of it I actually get and how much I miss as a reader.
Mm-hmm.
In reading this poem, I tried to use your theme as a lens.
Mm-hmm.
So I might have misunderstood it, which is fine. But I've been trying to work out if this poem is about a visitor, a tourist, a stranger at the door, someone arriving unexpectedly at the wrong time, perhaps death, perhaps mortality. Am I on the right track with any of that?
It's probably all those things, I think, David. It literally arises from the experience of living overseas for longer periods, but always arriving in the off season. It's a lot easier to get a place to rent in the off season because the summer tourists don't want the houses. And the experience in this case of returning to the same house at different times that actually belongs to someone else. So, but all those other things are kind of meant to be in there as well. And it is a strange time, probably very common experience for Australians going to Europe. I know it was when I was young and saved up pennies to go away, of going in the winter, which is our summer holidays. And everyone everywhere saying, what are you doing here in this season? Why don't you come in the summer? Well, it costs a lot more to come in the summer. But also just the sense that because the winter and the summer, there are so markedly such opposites, everything happens at that time of year that is kind of like the underside of the fabric, the bit that you're not supposed to see, whether it's the roads being fixed or the houses being renovated or all the things that are not tourist entertainment. And so it's also just meant to be, I suppose, a poem about the transience of one's belonging or dwelling somewhere. We have this idea of home, and home is an idea of fixedness. But for many people, home isn't fixed. And I mean, this is describing, I suppose, a privileged experience of going to live in another country, not permanently. It's not about permanent migration. but there is that sense of dwelling not being a permanent thing, even though we think, we say safe as houses and so on. Yet houses are the last thing in many ways that are safe. So there's a lot of that in there, and just the sense of transience in the sense of not belonging, I suppose, of never really belonging anywhere except temporarily, maybe.
Well, belonging is an illusion, but it's one we hold dear, isn't it?
Yes, it's something you need as well, because it's very hard. And the poem's trying to deal with that, I suppose, too, that in the sense that it's talking about a repeat return to live in a place. And so when it says the village has dropped the courting, all those little glamorous or romantic things that you find in a place when you first go and you think, oh, this is so wonderful. When you get to know it better, you think, actually, it's just like anywhere else. People are people, and I'm still myself wherever I go. But that's almost better in a way. You almost know a place better when it doesn't put on its best face for you anymore, and vice versa, when you're also being yourself in a place. Just the kind of slipperiness, I suppose, of and the sense also that being an Australian, when you go to the other hemisphere, you're always somehow carrying that difference with you. And a difference from a place in which you also, if you're from the settler colonial side of things, you also don't inherently belong, so there's that slipperiness too. And none of that's actually overtly in there, but I suppose it's all meant to bounce off a bit. So all those things you mentioned.
Yeah.
Yes.
And look, when you return home feels strange.
Yes. Yes.
So there's that as well, the other side of the coin. I read it even more broadly than that. I read it as kind of like the ultimate transience, the transience of a life. I mean, the whole of a life is,
yes,
in a sense, an exercise in transience.
Yes.
We're here and then we're gone.
Yes. And it feels, as I was saying before, it feels, and this is a commonplace observation, that it feels like it accelerates the more decades you go on. But it is really just a blink. And it's something that we have to live as if wasn't there, because if we sat down and thought about it all the time, it's almost too crushing. It's always struck me as strange that we live as if our plans are all going to happen. And if you sit and think too long about that, you'd do nothing. I intend to do this after this podcast, I'll do such and such, but really we don't know what's around the corner at all. So there's sort of transience in every direction, not just how fast the past has gone, but how slippery our projected notions of the future are.
It kind of reminds me of a wonderful story in Zorba the Greek, where Zorba sees this old man up on a hill in the heat of a very hot day planting a tree. And he says, "Oh man, what are you doing planting a tree on such a hot day?" And the old man says, "I live as if I'm never going to die." And Zorba replies, "I live as if this is every day is my last day." And I can never quite fathom which is the best way to live. They're both none of them are passive. They're both actively engaging in it. But
yes,
there is grappling with life and death throughout.
Yes.
And look, the way this poem reads, whatever is here, the season, you refer to a few of these things, the season, the village, the old premises, it's here and is then gone. You say is emptied out, becomes the caress of absence, a beautiful term. So the poem evokes the impermanence of all things. And knowing this to be true, we all know this to be true, my personal response was I felt like I needed to refute it and say, well, but even so, and yet, what about all these blessings we receive that, come and go, that make every moment of our lives a precious thing?
Yes, and that's the natural movement, and I think we have to do that. And in one of my books that I haven't selected from to read today is called The Argument, and that's really about that argument between the two, between life and death, or between Eros and Thanatos, and the two sort of sides of the coin of there's that, but there's also like these teeming vegetables that are growing in the garden, and this incredible lushness and sort of vehemence and energy in life. So you've got both of those at the same time. So I think that one always kind of implies the other. We wouldn't, otherwise we'd all just stop. If we let that weight crush us all the time of thinking, you wouldn't step forward if you had to think, is my step going to work? What's around the corner? If we thought that all the time, we wouldn't go around the corner. So yes, there are both, I guess.
Which is, you just answered my next question. So it's going to be, do these two ideas not sit by a side like ruin and beauty? And they do.
Yes, I think so.
And we're complex, so we embrace them both.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Cool. Another poem?
Okay. The next one is from the same book, Rose Interior. It's a little short poem called Ghost Story. Sometimes I catch the other me, elves to shoemaker, who's already filled the pot with water as I just turned to do, who's put the cups out right when I bent to get them, or cheekily drunk my tea when I was sure a last mouthful was still there. I'm slow, but only because she's faster. She's fear incarnate, yet disembodied. A ghosting image, the blur on a bad photo where you aren't quite yourself, hovers competently over the future, as if.
I love this. Is the other you here like a flicker on the edge of sight, or your reflection in a window or a mirror, or some kind of doppelganger? Or is it more a sensation of yourself as having passed this way before, like deja vu?
You know what? I'm going to say the same thing I said last time, which is
All of the
all of
above.
those. Yeah, all of the above. That's right. And I suppose it arose strictly from that experience that you have sometimes, or at least when you're nearly 60, you do, of going to do something and finding, hang on, I just did that. Now, these moments give you a little alarm, and then you think, no, actually, this has always happened. It's just that I'm noticing it more because I'm conscious of that. And then you start to think about the ways in which, how much of your action is automated, and how much of that sense of time passing and transience actually is that automation, where we're kind of operating on autopilot. And it starts to feel a little bit spooky, I guess, a little bit like you're being haunted by either other versions of yourself or future versions of yourself, where you may not actually be as competent as you think of yourself as being at the current age. So I guess there's all of that in there. As I say, these are experiences I always had. I wouldn't be the only person to have ever gone to pick up a cup of tea and then find, whoops, I've already drunk that. But the consciousness that there's something a bit eerie about it has increased as I've got older.
I mean, I'm attracted to the idea of you kind of reaching over to another self in a parallel universe that has just done something.
Yes.
We could all be doing multiple things similarly in other universes at the same time.
Yeah, it is a fascinating idea. Yeah.
Does this ghost of yourself have a voice, a presence? Do you address it? Does it address you? Or is it just a insubstantial, silent, smoky wisp?
Something insubstantial, I think. And in the poem, I think of it as like the elves and the shoemaker. The little, in the fairy tale, the little elves that come out by night and mend the shoes, and the shoemaker gets up in the morning and the work's already done. And so it's a wholly positive little imp in that sense. But that whole tradition of elf or sprite or kobold, I think the Germans call it, it can also be an imp that comes into your household and stirs things up and things go wrong. So there's a kind of like keeping it slightly at arm's length. I don't know that I'd talk to it so much as observe it and say, okay, there's more to me and to people than there seems to be. But the sense that there are other selves and other possibilities, I suppose, is there in the poem as well. Yeah.
Is it a teaching ghost? Does it teach you something about yourself?
That I don't know myself. Yes, absolutely. I suppose even in that, basic Freudian sense of having an unconscious, that there's things about ourselves. If there can be actions we've just done and we don't even remember doing them 2 seconds before, and this is not out of some form of dementia, but just a normal part of everyday life, then there must be so much more to us. We don't even remember our dreams a lot of the time. And when we do remember them, we're so amazed by what we find in them. Sometimes not, sometimes they're banal, but there must be so much more to us than we understand. And so a little bit of that is in there too, I guess.
Why is she fear incarnate?
Because she represents the possibility that I will have a future self that can't do any of these things and has lost consciousness of that. So that probably is a fear of cognitive decline. Maybe also a fear of not being needed. I think that as people age, especially, there's a sense that they're not needed as much as they were when, the culture portrays people as needed if they can be in the workforce or they're raising children or whatever. And so while you have a purpose, if you have these little elves that can come in and do it for you, others have taken over, you no longer have that function, I suppose. So there's that sense of loss of control, loss of control of your own purpose. Yeah.
Need to be useful. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
You mentioned that it was a short poem. I'm struck by how compact the poem is. You are evoking another sense of self, and the poem is very suggestive, but it leaves a lot unsaid. Can you say something about everything the poem doesn't say and why it doesn't say it?
Okay, everything it doesn't say. I think I really like poetry that just suggests or hints. I mean, it's in the nature of poetry to do that, but I especially like it when it just holds back where it could give a bit more, you know, that resists the understanding or the intelligence almost successfully, that quote. And I think that sometimes you don't want to say everything because you want to have more possibilities. People can read this poem to mean all sorts of things, and I don't want to close off any of them off.
Yeah.
But the things that aren't there, that aren't literally in there, probably are a lot of my readings of people's experiences of those who've lost the ability to direct their own lives. Probably also an indirect experience that's not mentioned in the poem is my mother having, in the last couple of years of her life, a temporary form of dementia. She actually underwent surgery that corrected that. So even though she was still declining, she came back to herself. She was a very eloquent, talkative person. So it was quite surprising to see her speech becoming inverted, reversed, and her frustrations with that. And so I suppose thinking through that experience, there is that realization of how a person's very personality can be apparently transient and slip in and out of different states. I think that's probably one of the unspoken things that's behind the poem, but it's not actually about that, if that makes sense.
Okay. Do you want to read another poem?
Okay, this is a very different poem from the same book. It's based on an item in a museum in Rome called the Sarcophagus of the Spouses. So that's the subtitle of the poem, but its title is Etruscan Love Song. I think we have an image, don't we, to go with this poem. So, okay, Etruscan Love Song. Give me your best archaic smile, the one that others think to understand, though truly mute and private, since you know whatever we were or are or will be is not here. This is a likeness, reconstituted after shattering, a thing and a thing standing in for what's without beginning or ending, only returning, without release. Steam does not escape, but is condensed eventually and falls and starts again. Yet see how our eyes are done, identical, familial and general. The jewel's distinctive luster lost. My feet so bound and laced and trussed. I must be up again and moving. No time to lose, eternity to keep. Your feet are bare. Your terracotta flesh is hairless, universal, just that single nipple speaking death's coldness, life's arousal. Likewise, my hands are empty. What they held, ointment or object, is of no more use, except to the gazer, who by shape and by gesture imagines us as we are elsewhere, on the outside, uncontained.
There's a lot in this poem, but I was wondering if one of the things in it is that it's speaking to our instinct to preserve as much as we can, whether through image or art or writing or statuary, even if what is preserved is something other than what was.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I think there is a sense that human experience, that the mute and the private in there is very much, for me, figured in this couple who are kind of unknown to us, who are stylized, so they look like any other. I mean, there are actually several of these sarcophagi, one in the Louvre as well, that are slightly different. But even though they're kind of generic people, their experience is so private and can't be known to us. But as humans, we can still know this was a human couple, and they've come down to us through time as something that represents a recognizable relation, I suppose. And it's also, the poem's also actually in dialogue with another poem, a Sylvia Plath poem called Last Words, in which she speaks in the voice of someone imagining a sarcophagus for themselves in the poem. And so there's that sense too of linking it to poetry and the commemorations that poetry enacts. I found the actual artwork itself very overwhelming. It was something you could stand and look at. It was very beautiful. A lot of the Etruscan art is very beautiful. And to just ponder something coming from so many centuries ago and having been all broken and smashed and stuck together again, just struck me as a metaphor for so many things, I suppose. The nature of memory too, and how we piece back together and try to construct what we preserve, even if it doesn't resemble what really was, you know. I mean, we're always guessing about the past when it's not our own past. Even when it is our own past, you know, we see it differently at different points in our life. So that's the likeness reconstituted after shattering, as well as the fact that the terracotta literally has cracks in it where it's been, because it's so ancient, been stuck back together again.
And you refer by gesture imagines us as we are elsewhere. And so you invoke our power of imagination. I mean, and poetry is always in conversation with poetry, and is always in conversation with art, and we are in conversation with all of it. These conversations continue.
Yes,
it's an integral part of our lives, and in that sense, we keep transience at bay in a way.
Yes, and I think that that's probably one of the things that draws me to poetry and to art in general, is that sense of being able to keep that overwhelming feeling at bay. There's something truly remarkable in seeing something that has persisted this long, for instance. And, you know, poetry even more so can do that because it doesn't rely on the physical nature of something lasting through time, but can actually just be orally, you know, I made it out of a mouthful of air, as Yeats says, is all it takes. It only needs people to remember it. It doesn't even have to exist as an object. So there is that sense in which it's that defiance thing again, that's actually defying the conditions and outlasting, even if it is just a mouthful of air.
Well, it doesn't even have to be remembered. It can be imagined.
Yes, exactly so. And so long as there's that possibility, that outstrips the transience too, I think.
So I was going to ask, but I think you've answered it. Does it matter that we treasure everything we can preserve, knowing that the urge is futile, that we can't take anything with us, and that most of who we are and what we have does not ultimately survive our deaths? It doesn't matter really, does it?
No. I think that what matters is that what we do with the gesture while we're alive and while we're there, you know, how much we make of it. So it might seem in some ways like a morbid preoccupation, and people say poets are always obsessed with death and so on, but it's actually the creative impulse in the face of that gives meaning to things, as far as I can see. And I suppose for some people it's the religious impulse in the face of that, you know, if they belong to a particular religion. But creativity for many people is that as well, whether they have a belief in something greater than the human or not. The idea that we can imagine and generate something positive from our lot, if I'm not getting too philosophical sounding and vague there. But yes, I think that art of various kinds probably fills that niche for me, that need to feel that there's some meaning, that it can give meaning or try to make meaning, even if it fails, try to connect people.
So it's an argument against nihilism in a way.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And look, I think that all of the poems that you're reading today on the theme of transience explore what lies between being and non-being. And you know, it's quite apparent here, because you're talking about death's coldness on the one hand and life's aroused on the other. So it's really about, I think, how we make meaning out of our lives.
Yes, indeed. And that particular part of the poem looking at the incredible, stylized, as I say, stylized sculpture has the little detail of the male figure's nipple, just one side showing because the female, his wife, is lying alongside him, which is apparently a kind of reclining position for eating, for a banquet. So it's quite an amazing way to commemorate someone in death in their funeral urn by having them at a banquet. And she has an empty hand where you don't know what the sculpture may have been holding because that's gone. But that one nipple showing on his body gives him a kind of specificity that says this was, even though this is a piece of terracotta and the person is gone, and in our age, long gone, it was a real person with sensations and a body, and that is like a symbol of that to me. It's a very strange little detail in the sculpture, and that's what made me think of the sort of coldness and the arousal at the same time around that image. Especially kind of sets you, when you look at such a thing, to imagining that people have had certain things in common over thousands and thousands of years and faced many of them, however different and unrecognizable we would be to them and they to us. So
yeah, this might be drawing a long bow, but where the poem observes that whatever we were or are or will be is not here, and then later on concludes, as we are elsewhere on the outside, uncontained. I was wondering if that was positing a notion of an afterlife of some sort, or of some place where whatever we are that is no longer here continues to reside and exist.
Yes, I think that I don't know whether I would see it in terms of an afterlife, because I have no idea. And that's the truthful thing I can say. People can say what they believe, but they can't say what they know. All I can say is I don't know. But I certainly know that people, and in fact, not just people, but probably all existence, animal existence of all kinds, is more than what we credit it with a lot of the time. So we're elsewhere and uncontained. Whatever images we can come up with that capture us are insufficient. And I suppose you could say the same about notions of God or a God or gods as well. Whatever words we can come up with to describe that kind of imagined reality are never going to be adequate. So everything kind of escapes and is bigger. And I was thinking, particularly in the Plath poem, the voice that wants the sarcophagus is saying, I do not trust the spirit, it escapes like steam. And so in a way, my poem, is trying to say that these things are not so. Her poem is very much about the material goods surrounding the tomb objects. And tomb objects are something that come up in a lot of my poems, because they are those things that go where we try and imagine in the ancient world that some of this world can go with you into the afterlife. So there is that sense of a tussle between the material and the spiritual in the poem. So I don't know that I'd say afterlife, but an afterlife in the mind, or a spiritual life that isn't necessarily religion, but is about the idea that we're more than just the flesh that we seem to be. And I think that that's probably true of all living things, not just humans. So yeah, I think there's more to the human, but there's probably more to all living creatures than the images we make for ourselves. Does that make any sense?
Well, look, I think so. I mean, I think it's a very rich sort of topic to explore, and there's a lot of room, for differences of opinion and speculation, really, because a lot of it's just speculation, isn't it?
Yes.
And you've mentioned how you don't think this is a morbid topic, and that it's a way of, in a way, defiance. I was going to ask, I don't see any despair in these poems. Is your poetic gaze on transience an attempt to look at it squarely in the face, whilst at the same time not yielding to despair, or are these poems also wrestling with despair in some way?
Yeah, I think they are wrestling with it, in the sense that I certainly do, like many people, experience a lot of despair, but the poems are not about that. They're about, I think, I mean, it's for other people to say also what a poem is about, but to me, they're about finding some way through that and saying, actually, there's also this, or actually, that's not all the time, or there is more in human beings than what causes despair as well. And that might come down to something as simple as looking at a sarcophagus that is a morbid thing in a way. It's, for holding someone's ashes thousands of years after they've died, but the incredible beauty of it and what it asserts, especially because they say, I mean, how true this is, I don't know, because I haven't done deep research on the Etruscans, but they say that there was a greater level of equality between men and women in Etruscan society than there was in Roman society, that came to dominate. and the idea that the women actually banqueted with the men and so on and were more equal is all encapsulated in that image for me. So there's a great positive thing to the image of the dead people, if that makes sense.
Mm.
So rather than it being a despairing dust to dust, we're all going to die, it's more like look at some of what we do, look at some of what we are. Yeah. So no, there's certainly despair, but hopefully not in the poems.
No, I didn't sense it in the poems, but I sensed it in the theme, which is why I raised the question. All right, well, read another one.
Okay. A strangely shaped little poem. I don't frequently do concrete poems, but this one is one. And it's in the shape of a kind of hay baling, traditional hay baling that they do in Switzerland. That is the shape of the poem, where the wild hay is wound around a pole or a stick. And they're called in Swiss German Tristan, which sounds a bit like the French word triste, meaning sad. And the poem begins with a quote from the book of Isaiah. All flesh is grass, and all its loveliness is like the flower of the field. Tristan. Grass monuments, anomalous. Squat columns of tamed wild hay the winter train runs by. I want to call them sad things, Tristan, but that is slippage. And these are set secure and sure as helmet hair, hugging the upright, marking what was. The man says, if you see them now, it's because someone's asserting tradition, like keeping up a turn of phrase when everyone's forgotten, or making this fleeting poem. Machines mean change in practice, the pushing out of strangeness. Surely the people are grass. These Tristan need translation if we are to read them, not white them out under greater salience, like the fact of fields and mountains robed in snow, the coming of snow at all.
Thank you for explaining the origin of the title, because I got derailed by that. I thought, oh, maybe this has got to do with Tristan and Isolde, even though Tristan is spelled differently.
I think there is the echo there as well, isn't there?
There is an echo there. And then I thought that Tristan was someone that you were addressing the poem to. But it's not that either, is it? It's not.
No, although, as I say, you can read those echoes. I mean, you can't help with the word. I think sometimes this is why I have included words other than English in poems where I've come across them, is because they spark off all kinds of ideas that may not be there in the original word, but transplanted into the other language, they provoke those. And there is that sense of the tragic in the Tristan stories. So, but yes, they're strange looking bales that you see in the mountains. And it's an old fashioned way of baling the wild hay. And now much of that stuff is replaced by machines. But when you have a mountainous country, of course, very often only on foot and by hand can people do these things. And so I suppose it was me coming to terms with something that looked so odd in the environment, and understanding that everything you see not only has changed, but is changing all the time. And occasionally there are attempts to bring back the old ways. That's really, in a way, what the poem is partly about, because the reason I even saw these in Switzerland is because some people are, in a heritage sense, going back to making this kind of baling. And we have equivalents here in Australia where people will go back to doing things by hand, or handcrafts, or hand printing books or whatever. So someone asserting tradition, like keeping up a turn of phrase when everyone's forgotten. There is that impulse in humans too to bring back what was. And sometimes what's been made obsolete was better. I'm not saying this necessarily was a better way. It depends on the context, but so I suppose it is really a poem about that sort of transience and the attempt to reclaim some of it, and how strange that can look if you're not part of that tradition, because to me they needed translating, they needed explaining. Because I just thought, what are those strange looking bales? Why are they hugging these poles and standing upright in the mountains? And there's a whole history and story behind them.
And there's a kind of play going on here. You mentioned, that the title is similar to the French word triste, which means sad, and then the poem talks about sad things. So you've got things resonating, bouncing off one another here, just in
Yes.
the terminology and the language.
Mm.
Was that deliberate, the sad things and the triste? And
Yes, I think so. I think so, because to me it was such a strange word, and it was quite hard to find out what they were called and what they were. But, you see something odd, you kind of want to identify what it is. And so I was just kind of thinking there is, to me, a kind of sadness in old ways, even though I wouldn't necessarily agree with farming cattle, for instance. As a vegan, that's something I'm not involved in. Nonetheless, the act of hay baling is something fairly universal across many cultures. And so to see an old method that was done by people by hand and see it disappear in a skill go has you meditating on how things disappear. And as I say, there'd be many equivalents of things here, even down to daily life in your own house, what you do by hand, whether you grind things, with a handheld grinder or you use an electric, that's all changing very quickly. And part of the reference in the poem to the coming of snow at all is the change going on in Europe. Of course, we're seeing very marked effects with climate change here because we've always been a hot country, and so we get horrendous fires and so on. But even in those places which we think of as so cold and so snowy in winter, they're seeing things like, are we actually going to get snow this winter? And people are, so it's like past things are not what they were, and that almost fruitless longing when I say fruitless longing for the past to come back, I'm not suggesting that it's a good thing we have climate change, but what I mean is we brought ourselves here. It's not something that just happened to us. So all of that is wrapped in with the poem, I guess, and the conservatism in the Swiss agricultural tradition as well is all in there. But the coming of snow at all, that's the reference, I suppose, in the end of the poem, because in the time that I was there was very much debate over whether there was actually going to be snow or adequate snow for the various things that people do in that season. And we have the same tensions in the opposite sense in Australia, that we can't go back to what was, and yet we need to stop what we're doing. And none of that is addressed overtly in the poem, but it's the background to the sadness at things that have passed, I suppose, in that way. So there is a bit of sadness in that poem, and linking it to the flesh being grass in Isaiah, the idea that we're just so temporary, we're just so in the fleshly sense, so temporary.
And snow is ephemeral; it just comes and goes.
Yes.
Do you have trouble finding that word, Tristan, and the meaning of that word? Because I looked it up on Wikipedia and I couldn't find it.
Yes. No. Sorry, I should actually put a footnote on it. I did at the time have trouble. I had to really dig to find that out. And I had to do various searches that said things like wild haymaking Swiss mountains and so on. And then I thought, right, okay, got the word. And then I got stuck on the word and thought that's what brought on the theme of, because it doesn't mean sadness in the Swiss German word. It's just the name for those bales. But that's the echo that it has for me. Yeah.
Now, I read this poem in several ways. And I know that there's no right or wrong way to read a poem, so I'll just go with that. I thought that it was serious, but with an element of whimsy. I mean, I felt that there was whimsy in the poem, and I felt that it also mocked itself because, as you say, you don't write many concrete poems or shape poems, but you've done that here, taking the shape of the columns of hay that it's referring to, referencing the secure and sure nature of them, even whilst asserting that they aren't really, and neither is the poem. The poem's fleeting. The hay marks what was, the poem itself is fleeting, and everything is slippage, as ephemeral as the coming of snow. So transience permeates the poem, and yet the shape and solidity of the poem seem to defy transience again. There is that defiance. I was wondering if you thought of this as a poem as an example of a poet at play, playing with form and structure, playing with the idea, having fun with the reader, all of those things.
Absolutely. It certainly was slightly mocking itself, particularly in the shape, because the shape was the thing that got me preoccupied with the objects, because I'd never seen bales of that sort. I mean, I don't know about where you live, but where I live, they're kind of rectangular prisms. Sometimes they'll be cylinders, or wheels. But to see these with the stick, I thought there's got to be a reason behind it. So and so that's why the poem kind of mimics that strangeness as well. So yes, it is meant to be playful, and same with the helmet hair, because it's what they say conservative women like Thatcher and other people I won't name on the coalition side of politics in Australia, the women tend to have this very hard set hair. And so that's the image there is of the traditional sticking with the way things were. There's that side as well that's slightly being played with or made fun of there.
She's gone, hasn't she?
Yeah, but the hair remains. Anyway, so yes, there is meant to be a little bit of lightheartedness, I suppose, in that image. It's not a serious image, but that strange contradiction between the grass, which is fleeting, and or hay, and the pole, which is meant to stake it out and secure it, is certainly, there's a kind of centrifugal thing happening where it's fleeing away from that in the poem too, and it is meant to be a bit playful and serious at the same time, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, would you like to read another one?
So this one's still from Rose Interior, and it's another Swiss landscape, and it's a very little short poem. Riet is like a fen or a bog, it comes from the word related to reed or reed bed, and it's in a place called Schmerikorn at the top of Lake Zurich. So it's called Schmerikorner Riet, which is the name of the bog. Schmerikorner Riet. Late in the world's beauty. Reed always cut. Bog drained or planted out. Fen must seed ground to soccer field. Newt pond yield to dog walk and leashes bridled at. It's no good being romantic. What use is lament? Old map shows a wetland that ran from lake to lake. Imagine it. That's all you'll get. Old map already chafing at the bit.
Well, once again, thank you for explaining the title, because you've got me chasing rabbits down burrow holes, because I sort of tried, I found Schmerikon as a place, couldn't connect it with Riet at all. So thank you for giving that.
It's one of those protected wetland areas, and it's what remains of it is beautiful. It's at the very top of Upper Lake Zurich, so where the first river feeds into the lake. But like with many places, not only in Europe, but in Australia too, when you arrive there in our era, what you're seeing is the remnants of what used to be. And it's always been human activity. I mean, in another sense, bogs and fens are often caused by initial human activity thousands of years before. I wrote another book of poems about the bogs of Ireland, which is a whole other set of things, that inevitably when I saw this one in Switzerland, I kind of, so, sometimes you write a book, and then in another book or a later book, there's still a little trace of that earlier project that creeps over, and it's because your interests overlap. So I couldn't help but think how we are constantly, when you're seeing places of incredible biodiversity or beauty, you're always being told, well, it used to have this or that, and it's now a third of what it was, or once a creature that's now extinct used to live here, and it's just that's the sad side. Yeah. And so that's why it begins late in the world's beauty. And I don't want to think that it's just a poem about, I want to go and admire the beauty of a place. It's more to do with the actual inherent nature of beauty, because for me, beauty is biodiversity and is ecology running the way it should, without human greed cutting it down and filling it in and, making it over. And even now, such places often have to justify themselves to be allowed to exist because they provide leisure for us. So that's why we have the reference. I've got nothing against dogs being walked and nothing against people playing soccer, but you will often find that places have a struggle in continuing to exist because somebody wants to put a soccer field there, or somebody wants to be able to walk their dogs there, but that may conflict with the bird life or the newt ponds or whatever. So, and this is not unique to Switzerland by any means at all. It's everywhere. So it's not having a go in that sense. It's a human thing that we want every square inch to be ours rather than to be itself. And I suppose that's really, and what really struck me after seeing this incredible place was that on the as the poem says, on the very old map, it shows a huge wetland that isn't there anymore. And this is so often the experience of seeing a place, is that template overlying it is, it used to be this or it used to be that, which has a kind of, so in that sense, it is a sad poem. But
I felt that all the power in the poem was held in its brevity. It says so much in so few lines. I was wondering if it started out as a longer poem that you had to cut back so that the end result is a distillation.
it probably was a little bit longer, not a lot longer. But yes, I wanted to make it say less because I think there are so many conflicting views on these things. And because one doesn't want to come across as saying you shouldn't have a soccer field, you shouldn't walk your dog, because obviously humans have to exist in the world too. But it's just, so I just want to put those things side by side with each other and have that sparse effect. And also related to the fact that it is quite small now. There's not that much left there to write about, but still very beautiful, and it still is protected. It strikes me that so many places, though, in the world that are protected still have to struggle to remain protected.
Yeah.
And that we people keep redefining what they can be used for, you know.
Yeah. And taking away the protections.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned the first line, late in the world's beauty.
Mm-hmm.
It's this beautiful line, and it contains so much for readers to think about. Did that line just come to you? Or is it like you had to prize out of a sea of words to...
No, that just was the first thing I thought of when I looked at it. It feels like here I am, but I'm too late to see this the way it once was. And there's a lot of that around beautiful areas of Lake Zurich because, you know, it has a capital city basically running along the edges of the lake, in many cases with some incredibly lavish houses built right up to the water's edge. So this fen or bog is one of the areas where that isn't the case. And there are a few like that where the edge of the lake is more natural. And so you really notice that you've come late and that the city has grown up as human cities do. And dominated the landscape.
Now you've got two lines here in italics. It's no good being romantic. What use is lament? Are they italicized because they are specifically directed from writer to reader, or is there some other reason for them being in italics?
It's really voices that speak at me, probably from very early in life, where you would say it's a pity this has happened, and people would say, well, it's no good being romantic about it. You know, we don't live in that world now. We live in the industrial world, and so on and so on. So there's partly that, but there's also the writer's voice saying, asking myself, what use is lament? Because lament can become indulgent and stop you doing things. You know, if you become the kind of poet who's just saying, I'm writing laments for the beauty that was, in what way am I also contributing to it, I suppose, is what I have to ask myself. So it's a bit of both. It's a bit of voices I disagree with and voices I am raising for myself, because romantic with the capital R would be the idea that, you know, human progress has messed up the world and we need to go back to what was. I think there's some truth in that, but I'm not a pure romantic. There was also a lot of indulgence in the sense that kind of viewpoint can be very much about, look what all of you have done to the world while I, the poet, lament. You know what I mean? Whereas in fact, it's all of us. It's we, it's not you. And so really that's what that's saying, is that I have to ask myself when I'm looking at this incredible fen, here I am, a person walking around looking, wanting to see the nature and wanting to see the beauty. How does my travel and my consumption and my everything else contribute to that stuff? You know, what about the dog walking where I don't walk a dog, but, you know, just for example, what about the equivalent of that is done where I live? It's very, you know, the tourist is always somebody else, you know what I mean? And I really didn't want to do that. So I guess that's why those two little lines are in there.
I wonder if we all had this little sort of calculator that calculated our carbon footprint every day and sort of gave it back to us, we'd probably be
shocked. Yes, indeed. And so I suppose that's what uses lament means, is one, I have to analyze my own lament and say, you know, how much am I criticizing myself here? It's actually me too. It's all of us.
But you're not invalidating being romantic or lamenting.
No.
Those things, we need to do those things, so.
But we also need to question them at the same time and say, actually, how much am I causing the thing that I'm lamenting as well? So, and hopefully that's just suggested. That's why it's very minimal rather than explored, you know.
Yeah. What do you think this poem has to say to the argument that all change that we make to the world, such as in our removal of fens and bogs and wetlands, is just a form of evolution? It's an unnatural and forced evolution, but it's just evolution all the same, isn't it?
I guess what I would say in the context of this poem is that there are better evolutions and worse ones, aren't there?
There are.
And that and I suppose that's only just hinted. That's why it says imagine it, imagine that wetland that ran from lake to lake, because that's all we seem to be able to do. But it's really important that we do that imagining, because the moment we give up and say, no, this is just the course of human, and a lot of people do say that, you know, this is just human existence, get used to it. This is the way human beings are. But we have to be able to imagine an alternative way of living in the world and not destroying it. And that's why it says imagine it, and that's all you'll get. You have to do the rest yourself, essentially.
Okay. Next one.
This is a slightly longer poem from the same book, Rose Interior. Its title is actually part of a line from a George Herbert poem, so from hundreds of years ago. The title is All Blasted, All Wasted. If drinkers have lost years, so do the fallen out, the friends estranged, the sons or daughters fled from home for good. You can't remember it for them, reconstruct what ran in parallel, read them back into it. You are dead to them. When I was 16 and my brother died, at first I wrote him letters, crammed them to keep him up to speed, as if he needed that. But days outran me. I had to live them, not just fix and flatten, as in a press. And where could I send words? From pile to poem, real-time account since then. And every jot not taken runs riot, unsecured, a dangerous load. But these are not dead. The friend who darkens doorways in nightmare only, who's paired from all photos, spectre that can't manifest. Everything rolls on behind his back. He's no share in the story of his absence. Steps fall short of the threshold. Knock stops before handle. Silence is merely all the calls that never came. Birthdays and certain other dates pass like comets over the plague village of your feelings. Gross omens. No word from the daughter. Even pandemic won't bring her back. It's a luxury of the young, even when lifelong, to think you can put things off.
I found this poem quite haunting, actually. And it's surgical to me, dissection of the immense loss that comes from estrangements of all sorts. And it seemed to me that this had to be lived experience. I could be wrong. If it's not too personal, can you say something about how you came to write this poem?
Well, it was during the pandemic, as you can probably feel from during the first part of the pandemic, I should say, which was slightly different, of course, in Western Australia than it was for a lot of Australia, because the force was held at bay for the first year or so. So we had a staggered experience of what COVID did to people's lives. Yeah. And at such times, I suppose everybody did a bit of taking stock of what connections were essential, how far they would go, whom they would seek to see, checking up on people they hadn't checked up on for a while, all those sorts that made you reassess all your relations with people. So I suppose that's really the driver behind it. And in the George Herbert poem, he's basically talking about, it's called The Collar, and he was a religious man, and the voice in the poem is arguing with itself about, I don't need God, I don't have to, I can be free, I can be out of this. And looks back over a year and says, is the year lost to me, or something like that. He says, all blasted, all wasted, and then tries to find what was good. And so I suppose that's the taking stock of, is everything blasted and wasted? Is there still something there? And that leads to meditating on that kind of loss, which is, although there's some personal information in there, it's also generic. I think it's true for many people that there are people in their lives that they've either lost touch with or fallen out with, and at such times, maybe their thoughts go there and they think, I wonder how so-and-so is doing, but I can't contact them, or whatever. It's just that heightened emotional state that most people would have experienced then in terms of your connection to others, because suddenly that connection is reduced or controlled in a way that you don't have that imagined liberty to go somewhere or to be with people. So that's the context of it. And the longer you live, the more people you lose touch with, I suppose, as well as the friends that you keep, you know. And sometimes you think about getting back in touch with people, but then you think, no, they would have contacted me by then, if that had been important. And these are the stories we tell ourselves, and that way those estrangements go on. But the bit about my brother there is probably, to me, the most relevant thing, because I sometimes think that my becoming a poet was because of losing my brother when I was 16. He was 18. Not just because I started writing then, but because it shifted my way of seeing the world. Because, you know, I'd had a fairly, I wouldn't say protected, but I hadn't experienced death up close then. Many people experience it earlier than that, of course. But yes, I coped at first by writing him lots of letters as if he was still alive, and then realized actually I can't keep this up. Every day's going to go by. I can't do this every day. At some point I have to let go and accept that the person's not the other end and not listening. But that is almost like the trainer wheels for riding the bicycle of poetry, starts you delving into things. What would you tell someone if you could pass things on to them? So that's that experience. And I suppose death is the ultimate separation from someone in that regard. But yes, the idea that there are some people you would never contact again, or they would never contact you again, even if the world came to its worst as it did in those years. That's what's happening there. But it's meant to be not just about me. It's meant to be about all of us, I think. So it doesn't have to be read too specifically. And it is also something I have observed as I've grown older, that when you are young, so that's not an attack on the young, it's knowing myself also when I was a young person, you think you have forever to get back to someone you've lost touch with, and you think, I'll fix that one day, or I'll write them a letter one day, or time will have passed and things will have settled, and you don't realize how that's not actually up to you. Life isn't like that. It's more complex than that. So that's really what's behind the poem.
It strikes me that each of us, we live our own story, and others intersect with that story. They move their stories in and out of ours, whether by happenstance or circumstance or choice or from conflict. Drawing a distinction here between those whose comings and goings from our lives happen kind of organically, those whose departures from our lives are from rupture of some sort and therefore more fun.
Yes, and I think really this poem was, apart from the one which is the death, which is the ultimate rupture, I guess, that nobody has any control over, or very little, it is meant to be about estrangement, which is a much more common experience than people admit to. One of the things I've realized through reading, in fact, is that it's so common that you can find lots and lots of material about it where people talk about it, but you don't talk socially about it. Somebody doesn't say, well, actually, I have a brother or a sister who won't speak to me. That's not a social thing you do. So it's a reality, like an unspoken reality that a lot of people are living with. There's often someone in their life that would carry a very enormous charge if they ran into them in the street or whatever, whatever kind of relationship it was. I think that's actually much more common than we admit to. And it is a very hard thing to grapple with. Because it's something that's not entirely within our power. So in that sense, there's a transience of relationships that's being looked at in the poems, and sometimes they can be fixed and sometimes they can't.
Yeah, so, I mean, I certainly picked up on the relationships being transient, and that I guess the suggestion is that some end prematurely when they need not end.
Yes. And there's a sadness. I sound like I'm being sad all the time here, but there is a sadness to that. But there's also, of course, what's not in the poem is the relationships that have endured. So it depends what the topic is that you're writing. You know what I mean? So you have ongoing ones that do. And you can't even use them as an instructive thing to say, well, what should I have done or what could I have done? Because every person is different. Some friendships endure and some don't. Yeah. And you can't go back.
And some do come back.
Yes, some do.
30 years later, somebody knocks on your door. And
yes, exactly so. And I, within my extended family situation, there have been this is not estrangements, but, family members who were adopted out and so on, who've come back decades later and formed really strong relationships within the family. So it's just that this poem happens not to be on that topic. But yes, so the opposite is true too. But yes, the whole diversity of relationships, I suppose.
And if we're going to be talking about transience, it's partly about the fact that we try so hard to hold on to things and can't, at least not always and not for that long. They go from us, whether we want them to or already or not.
Yes.
And then they are no longer part of our story directly. you refer to them as an absence.
Mm-hmm.
But yes and no, because don't they also remain present in memory? Don't they flit inside our heads like shadows? Don't we carry them still inside our own story?
Yes, that's an interesting point you raised there, David, because I've often thought of that with regard, not so much with regard to the friendships issue, but with regard to when people are deceased, how strongly they continue to exist in the people who knew them. And it's often struck me that when somebody passes, one of the strongest things you can do to cope with it is meet with or talk with other people who knew them. I mean, everybody does. That's a natural thing to want. It's hard if there's nobody else who knew them, and that's because somehow they still exist between the two people who knew them. There's a presence there that is hard to define. They do go on existing in our minds, our dreams, and our memories. So it does make you think about the whole slippery nature of what a being actually is, because and I suppose that's what books do for me too, because many people, even though it's unpopular to say, because the author is dead and the book doesn't really represent what the author intended and all that sort of thing, which is true. But at the same time, the person persists in some strange way in the books they've written also, if they are a writer. So for me, a big part of literature is that, actually, the persistence of people who may have lived centuries before me, but somehow I come to know them. And I often think that with the French writer Stendhal, the novelist, because he used to say things like, I'll be read in 100 years' time or more, and I wish I could know the people who are going to read me. He'd like to have met them. He especially hoped that lots of women would read him, and he'd be understood. And so there is that.
I'm less ambitious. I'd like to be read now.
I think the reason was that he wasn't very much read in his now, and so he consoled himself that the time would come when he would be recognised and people would understand him. But there is that sense for me in literature that there's a persistence, very strong persistence of people, even though you can't conflate the author with the text and so on and so on. Still, you're getting something of their world that is passed on.
My father's been dead for 17 years, but he sits on my left shoulder. His little voice in my ear on my left shoulder. I still channel him all the time. So
yes, and it is particularly strange. One of the things, here's a strange variation on it. There are people I've never known who might be a relation of my partner who died years ago, but who persist in my partner with little gestures or little symbols or little jokes, and I feel I knew that person. So there's that weirdness as well. And there's a poem in that somewhere. Somebody's little joke or somebody's little way that they hop or skip or something that is someone I never met, but they're connected to me through a very long-term marriage, and I feel like I knew that person. So there is a strange persistence of human beings even after they're gone, I think, even despite the transience. Yeah.
Yes, idiosyncrasies get passed on. Look, I mean, you can't talk about transience without sort of thinking about sadness, as you mentioned, and loss. And there is grief in every loss, and we carry that with us. Do you think this poem is a poem of grief?
Yeah, I think there's grief in it. It's probably more detached than that, because what I was trying to do, I suppose, was observe. Like the C.S. Lewis book, A Grief Observed. It's kind of like observing the grief and detaching oneself from it, and recording it. But it's certainly there. And I think when it says birthdays and certain other dates passed like comets over the plague village of your feelings, you have with most such things, if you're a person who happens to remember birth dates or anniversary dates or whatever, there's this constant reminder. So the transience is also repetition and persistence. It's passing, but it comes back. It's passing, but it comes back, and so becomes a part of your consciousness, I suppose. But certainly that's the grief is in there, yes. But it's trying to be analytical of it, I guess, rather than an expression of it.
All right. Would you like to read us another poem?
I think if I've got these right, we're now moving back. This is from an earlier book, which is called The Water Bearer. So that's from 2018. And this is the poem that opens that book. It begins with a quote from the poet Paul Verlaine that says, Dis qu'as-tu fait, toi que voilà, de ta jeunesse, which means essentially, say, what have you done, you there, with your youth? What did you do with it? So what did you do with your youth? And he was writing in the context of prison time that he did, where he had a chance to look back over things he had done. But the carousel is actually about literally a carousel with my son on it when he was young. And through this book, you can actually see as my son ages, because he's different ages in different poems. But he was 8 at this point. Carousel. Because in a foreign city, even at 8, he needs the familiar nearby to hitch the gaze like the reins of that lacquered horse to a fixed spot in order to let loose. Someone to witness his flight, or he can't fully feel it. Body forward, but head turned to the side, my side. He keeps me pinned here on a bench at the roundabout centre, where I give back affirmation, looking out from my still point, dead as a cyclone's eye. I'm as much part of the furniture as each faceted mirror, each Parisian pom-pom and papa, mutely crucial like the unseen inner wheel of the hurdy-gurdy, the curlicued chairs and pastel tableaus, where small folktale scenes suffer grotesque encroachment, but nevertheless stay put, defying centrifugal force. I am what was, and he is what will be, launching eternally into a churning future. Over our heads, it says, La Belle Époque, La Belle Époque, La Belle Époque.
Yeah, I should have said at the outset, Tracy, that if there are things about any of these poems that you want to say that I don't sort of tease out with my questions, please feel free to sort of talk about.
Yeah, no worries, no problem.
So I'm interested in the poem's references to witnessing and to affirmation.
Mm-hmm.
Is it suggesting that witnessing and affirmation validate an experience, make it more real?
I think in the context of the parent and child relationship, absolutely. And what I'm thinking of when I'm writing this poem is partly, I suppose, you think of your own childhood memories of being on a roundabout or a carousel and you're watching your own child on it, but also the sense that the sense of eternal return or repeat, the repetition, the persistence, if you like. So that's the opposite side of the coin of transience. Yes, I can do this. So the child feels I can do this, even though it's pretty fast and pretty unnerving. I can do this because you're sitting there, you're watching me, and I have a secure point. You know, like in ballet when they pirouette and they do the spotting, where you keep, each time you turn, you're supposed to, I've never done ballet, but I've read about this. You're supposed to look at a certain spot so you don't lose, you don't break your turn. And so I suppose there's that. I'm pinned in the center so that he can fly, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
And I think that is a big factor for me in parenting. I mean, he's grown up now, but at this point, that the apparently secure pinning down of the parent as being the thing that gives affirmation and can say, yep, you can do this, you're okay, is part of the experience of being able to let go, and maybe one day let go completely as kids grow up. So there's all of that in there, I suppose.
So you could imagine the child going around and all of a sudden the parent's not on the bench, and then what happens with the child?
Yeah, well, I thought it was interesting that they actually had a bench at the middle of the roundabout. So you're sitting in the core of it, not sitting outside it watching them, but you're actually on board with them, but you're not whizzing around like they are. So maybe lots of kids use it in that way, but certainly it was like that spotting when you do a pirouette, you know, just keep watching. Yeah, mum's still there. And because you're also in a foreign city, so it's not your home city, it's a place where you don't know your way around, but it was a pretty exhilarating experience for both of us, I suppose.
I was wondering whether it might be like, you know, the physicist sort of thing about how a particle observed changes its behavior, and that the engagement of witnessing changes both the observer and the person observed.
Yes, indeed. And changes the experience that each person is having too. Because if I was just watching the carousel going around and my child wasn't on it, I also see it completely differently. Right. But in a way, I suppose a poem about the sense that, you know, the idea that, especially the older you get, that you're the past in a way, and their life is future, and there will come a point at which it detaches and you won't be part of it, you know, or you'll be much less a part of it than you were, which is in there too. And
but observing, you can channel your past, right?
Sorry?
by observing it, you can also channel your past.
Yes, exactly so. Yes, because it makes you, like in the Verlaine poem, look back and say, actually, what was my childhood and how does this, that's kind of very distant anchoring of the poem, partly because it was in Paris and I was thinking about French poetry, I suppose, and because also the merry-go-round actually had La Belle Époque repeating around the surface of it, which seemed to me incredible image of not only the historical Belle Époque that belongs to the French poetry I'm thinking of, but the beautiful time in your life as well when you're a child and you have that witness and that person, if you're so fortunate, you have someone who's watching over you. It's that too.
Yeah, I thought it was a beautiful meditation on how there are often, if not always, completely different perspectives of the same experience.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, in my experience, sometimes that can be a source of great anguish.
Mm-hmm.
But here, it seems to me, it's a joy. And you know, there's an adult perspective. You're the adult reflecting with a context of the present as one moment in the continuum between the past and the future, and you're like
Yes.
somewhere in the middle of that continuum.
Yes.
And the child's perspective, which is more rooted in the present, just
Mm-hmm.
like but leaning into that future.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then the adult appreciating the child and the moment. So yeah, that's how I read. That's how I read it.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I think that's something of what I was trying to do with it. So that's very reassuring to hear that that's what you get from it. And I think that at the time that I wrote it, I wasn't consciously thinking of the various other carousel or merry-go-round poems that exist, but there are quite a few. So it's actually a genre of a poem.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
There's probably quite a few poems about everything we've written about.
Yeah, but carousels especially seemed, I suppose it's the artifice of them, you know, with the strange creatures. There's a Rilke poem and various others that that deal with them. It is that strange image of childhood and repeating around and around, turning around. But yeah.
You've mentioned the aspect of observation, and I think poetry at its heart is all about that. And this poem preserves a moment in a kind of poetic amber. The moment itself is temporary, it's fleeting, and it's gone, but you can always return to it through the lens of the poem now. Do you think that poetry is in a kind of eternal dance with transience?
Yes, absolutely, I do. And it's funny you should say that because some of the other poems that I wrote when my son was little have sometimes helped us track back to when did such and such happen, you know, so the moment is recorded in the amber, as you say, in the poem. But I think that it is, as I say, I wouldn't like to say that it arrests a moment because I think there's more flux than that. I don't think you can stop and preserve for good, but you can capture something in the way that a photograph can maybe, and the photograph can lie as much as the poem can. It's not necessarily real, but it tells you something, who takes the photograph or who writes the poem. You could get two different people who were both there to write that poem about that carousel event. You'd get completely different poems. So it's an interesting, it's like almost like a lens, a particular lens, rather than even the amber. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a particular way of capturing a moment that is idiosyncratic to whoever's capturing it.
It's one of many versions of your truth of that moment. Yeah.
Yes.
Do you think there's something heroic in the human endeavor to record and preserve in the face of time's eradication of everything?
Yes, I do. And I think that there is in language. I think it's an incredible, when I say language, obviously I mean languages, the incredible proliferation of them is one of the most astonishing things that humans have produced. And so the use of it for that is a major thing, you know. It's almost the only thing, like I said, about passing on from previous centuries and millennia. It's incredible that we can actually read people's poetry from thousands of years ago. I mean, that to me is something I never, a bit like the sarcophagus, I never actually stop pondering how remarkable that is. And so I do think there's something heroic about it, and also endlessly entertaining and inventive as well. So it can be humorous, it can be flippant, it can be shallow, or it can be deep. It's for me, poetry is kind of at the core of all other literary practice. I mean, I write fiction as well, but I think poetry encapsulates something that comes from what language is. It's like a lab in which you tinker with language, if that makes sense.
Oh,
You're actually finding out what language can do.
yeah, and it's like, the common expression is that everything's been said before, but not everything has been said before in the way that you happen to say it.
Yeah. And every person will say it differently and differently at different times in their life and in different moods. So it's fairly endless. No, I do think there's something quite, humans haven't accomplished much that's good. So maybe that's one thing they have.
Okay.
That doesn't sound too pessimistic.
Well, we'll have to balance it with, the verdict's not out yet completely.
Yeah.
But,
I suppose that's true.
You've got another poem for us.
Yes, this is a little poem, also from The Water Bearer, 2018. It's called Transit. It's the poem about the feather that I mentioned before. Transit. Not even lifting a finger, but with that swing from walking, unconscious, palm open, I catch it without volition. It catches me. This white, minute feather, brush too aloof to be called soft, but it did stop. Weightless as snowflake and just as blankly obvious, the loss, the newness, loose from a nest, a fledgling, though there seemed neither tree nor bird anywhere near me to furnish it so listlessly, indifferently, and I could not say what became of it when it finished with me, glanced off, as if it too might melt or dissipate, as if without root in flesh or destination.
I couldn't help but think of the feather in Egyptian mythology against which, a heart is weighed, and whether or not you pass into the afterlife. It seemed to be channeling that in this poem.
Yes.
This poem seemed to me to be almost like a prayer or a blessing. Would you say that?
Yes, in that sense that we were talking about before, of kind of spiritual things that aren't necessarily religious, but have that sense of something a bit bigger than our ordinary world. And it came from a literal experience of suddenly finding a feather out in the middle of a street where there were no trees and no birds and nothing, but obviously was floating around. And also such an obvious symbol. It's almost too small to make a poem out of, but I couldn't stop thinking about it because it was so strange. And then it did just dislodge itself and fly off again. And very, very slight thing. And it seems to me that tiny little moments like that can sometimes balloon outwards into a lot of, I don't know that I call it thinking necessarily, but a lot of thinking and feeling that finds its way into a poem. So it's very general symbolic. There's no specific bird. I don't know what feather it was. I don't know where it came from, but it's just one of those little moments where something almost from another dimension crossed my path, or I crossed its path, because we tend to read the world as if it pertains to us rather than we're an element in the world. And I'm trying to capture that in the poem too, that there's, rather than the feather landed in my hand, this human got in the way of the feather. Who knows? It's such a tiny, tiny thing. It's a question of scale as well. That often our view of things is at our own scale rather than at the minute scale. And that really interests me, the idea of looking at the very minute and apparently trivial things. That's always interested me.
Yeah, because I think, and I think part of the role of poetry is this too. You observe the big and the small, but you observe the big in the small. And you could say this poem is a metaphor for our lives. I mean, it wouldn't be stretching it too far, and in that case, it's not small at all. It's quite a big thought.
Yes, well, that's what's interesting, I think, within poetry, that kind of concertina-like thing that it has, that you can have a small thing that expands out to refer to other things, hopefully by not overstating anything. That's always the aim, to try and keep it minimal. But
show, not tell.
Yeah, one hopes. But it was just one of those experiences that I probably wouldn't forget happening even if I hadn't written the poem about it, but the poem cements it. So, because it's a trivial, as I say, it's a trivial thing. It's not that something happened. It's a non-event to have something small land in your hand. It probably happens 20 times a day and you don't notice it when you're walking. You know what I mean? So it's about notice and attention to things too. I often think that that's one of the things that is most interesting in poetry, is making you pay attention to things you wouldn't otherwise pay any attention to, because you're thinking poetically about them, the small things.
Yeah. I'm wondering whether I think there's a Jungian sort of idea that I can't remember exactly how it went, but there's a butterfly at the window, and you just happen to notice it because you're looking out that way, and it's like it's a message in a way from the universe to you that you're meant to notice it. It's there to notice it. And there was a Eric Ajong, of all people, I think, wrote that books lie in waiting for people to read them when they're ready. And there is that sort of synchronicity between a person's readiness and openness to something and the thing that happens.
Yes, I guess that sort of relates in a weird way to the now very much kind of cited idea of mindfulness, of actually, which in my experience earlier in my life wasn't so much called that, but came through ideas of meditation. And, because I was brought up very religious, even though I'm not now and haven't been since my 20s, but that idea of kind of contemplation and slowing and observing the actual moment that's happening right now and being sort of empty and open to it. To me, that very much, I suppose I said before that poetry probably and literature probably occupies that niche for me, creativity, of what religion used to. And so it is a way of drawing that attentiveness or that mindfulness. When you see something poetically, it does that, I think, as much as meditation or prayer or those kind of elements that people have for slowing things down and looking at what's there waiting for them, presenting itself to them, if that makes sense.
So as poets, we observe. Our lives everyone's life is full of observation anyway, and of participation, of endless intersections with both the animate and the inanimate, as with a feather. Every intersection like that in this poem is a fleeting and transient thing, but I'm just wondering at the accumulation of all those transient things, that they make up a life, don't they? And that's a wondrous thing, isn't it?
Yes. And so many of them are, I suppose the other thing that interests me is those points at which you encounter something that could have gone a different way. And that comes back to the poem about the elves, the other me, the alternate universes that you mentioned, that at each point something could have been other than what it is.
Yes.
That also is an interesting thing that poetry, I think, can open out. And why I say, like also with the environmental despair or ecological despair, it doesn't have to be a necessary part of human so-called progress that we go that way. There are always potential other moments. And if poetry can do anything, it can draw our attention to that potential, I think. And so that's what use lament can be, I suppose, to answer my own question, if we put it to that use.
I think we're probably getting to answer this next question. Is there a lesson in this poem that we can stop to appreciate something, the serendipity of a particular moment or intersection, and then savoring that appreciation, learn to let it go? Because letting go is a hard thing.
Yeah, I think that's really part of what part of what was in the back of my mind, for what that's worth at the time, was the idea that some things actually not only just escape us, but escape us in the sense of not really understanding either. That there are these moments. That's what, if anything, what it kind of symbolizes for me, is these moments that don't seem to have, there's no volition in it, there's no explanation in it, but some things in life are simply like that. You experience them and then they're gone, but you can let them go. Yeah, so very much part of it. And they let you go.
Yes, indeed. All right, you've got one final poem for us.
Yes, I have one more poem. This is from a much earlier, from 2013. It's, again, a first poem in a book, so that's by chance. And it's about a long ago relationship, and the town named in the poem, that's the title of the poem, is Karlsruhe. I know there's a Karlsruhe in Victoria spelt differently, but it means Karl's Rest. I think the town was named for a noble or ruler who was called Karl. And so that's why the town's called that. But it's actually just about being transient in that place. So spending one night there on a journey. and the transience of the relationship. Okay, so, and I'm just trying to see if there's anything, the word schau, it just means look in the context, but speaking to a German speaker. So that's why it says that. Karlsruhe. Do you remember Karlsruhe? We pitched one night there, heedless, on our way elsewhere, though I couldn't describe or find it again now. Chosen for name alone, like sticking pin in map, or scrying, your rest a good omen, because journeys must be broken, though they seem seamless. That any point's potential is the end, we didn't know then. Now, if I could wake you up from this last rest, this incubus, turn, schau, there's the corner pub that random admitted us nameless as love. Was the room warm? Your hands were, and your cheer. We ate potatoes, drank beer, went upstairs to the dim, deep privacy of what's forgotten. Our space, our time, relished and wasted. Till with morning, well rested, without let or hindrance, we moved on. As if there were always more where that came from. And not this blank to answer for, this calling home.
Yeah, I figured we couldn't really explore the theme of transience without a journey poem, could we? There had to be a journey poem.
Exactly. Exactly. And that was one of those strange journeys where you have a train pass that allows you within a certain limited time to get on trains for no extra cost. And so you have the leisure of saying, where shall we stop? Shall we stop here? Shall we stop there? And it was about halfway to where we were going. And it had the name of the person I was traveling with and said his rest. And so it seemed that, okay, we'll stay there. So it just total touristy passing through a place.
Yeah.
And I suppose in a way that's part of the point of the poem is it's a real place to real people who live there. In the context, it was a point on the map of a journey that two people were going through, which is very long ago. And where the context is that it's in this book, which is a book of elegies, not just for that person, but the first section of the book is entirely about that relationship. And the second section is elegies about other people that I've known. So it's actually probably the most about transience of the books that I've written. And it's not the very first poem. There's a little intro poem, but it's the first poem of the section called Karlsruhe. And very much also about the fact that you can't entirely retrieve a reality that was, even when you are trying to remember. There's something that remains private and gone about the past as well as remembered. It's quite interesting how much of the daily details of living with a person, when it's very long ago, that you can't necessarily even remember. And that strikes me as it must be in your mind somewhere. You know, we must have layers and layers of things that we store away, but they're not always retrievable.
There's just too much to retrieve.
Yes, especially when it's comfortable or daily or routine. Those are the things that go. It's the things that are unusual normally that you remember. So it's a lament for someone who's died long after I knew them, and that's why it's basically saying, do you remember speaking to the dead? A lot of the poems in that book are actually speaking to the dead, I suppose.
But going back to the idea of journey and using that as a sort of metaphor for things, journeys embody transience probably more than anything, as moving through place and time, through emotional and physical states, through borders, through landscapes, states of mind. Do you think every poem is a kind of journey like that?
Yes, I do. And the idea that journeys must be broken is the sense that each poem also is a kind of step on a journey as well. So especially for the poet writing them, I suppose, which is part of why I often can't bear to look back at earlier poems, because I feel like I've been there, and you want to go to the next thing. I don't know how common that is, but I think that it's quite hard to do, to go back and inhabit previous realities and previous places, if you like, if you're thinking of it spatially,
do you sometimes go back and say, did I write that?
Yes, absolutely. And I think it was
that person who wrote that poem.
Yes, the podcast that you did with Lisa Gorton, I think she mentions the strange feeling as if somebody else wrote it. And I really related to her saying that, because I do very often look back and think that where did that come from? It doesn't, I don't think it was me. But yeah, that's maybe in the nature of how poetry gets written, that there's a semi-conscious thing to it as well, you know, where you're not entirely in control of what you're doing. You're responding to certain impulses and certain habits and certain trainings and certain readings that make something come forward, but you're not entirely in control of the process.
And you have hundreds and hundreds of layers of self.
Mm-hmm.
So any earlier layers might have written that, but
yeah, and you're not there anymore. And in that sense, that is like the journey. You're no longer in that place, essentially. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you elaborate on the poem's reference to this last rest, this incubus? Because
yes,
I thought initially that the last rest was referring to death, but that seems an odd reference to this incubus.
Yes. Okay. Well, I suppose there's a dual thing there, because the book is essentially about what is often called by theorists disenfranchised grief. That is to say, grief where it's really not appropriate that you be grieving for that person. So you were married many decades ago, you divorced, you don't know that person anymore, and then you hear that they've died. So you're revisiting and thinking, where do I put this? Where do I put this experience? Because in the tidy version, it's supposed to be that you feel nothing, especially when you've moved on and you've made another marriage and your life is different and so on. Okay, the last rest so literally refers to the fact that the person has passed away. But there's also the rest that is in Karlsruhe and the putting things to rest. And the incubus is as much whatever it was that seized upon him and took his life, as it is the thing that's possessing me as I write the poem. What is it that I can't exorcise or get rid of, that the past is coming back like an incubus and is actually grabbing and saying, no, I'm not letting you go. And that's really what the book is about, is and I suppose all grief is about eventually learning to let go. It's like the feather we were just talking about. So yeah, the last rest and the incubus, that for me, literally, that's what those refer to. But I suppose there's any number of things you could read it as.
I haven't focused on them, as we've been talking much, but each of your poems contains for me what are really telling lines. And they're telling for me because they contain a backstory, which is alluded to. We've talked about this a little bit, but not told. So, for example, here are the lines, heedless on our way elsewhere, and without let or hindrance, we moved on, speak to so much in all of our lives, and could be the titles for whole books, really. Can you say something about how you make space in your poems for your readers to wander around in?
I think that's a really important thing, because when I was very young, somebody once asked the question of what makes a poem different from, different from a diary entry. And I think, other than the obvious answer of, the particular form and craft that you use and the metaphor and whether it's versified as meter or not and so on, there's also what you do and don't tell. A diary entry is something you presumably write for yourself, unless you're writing for an audience. Whereas in a poem, for me, what you're trying to do is present just enough that it opens up areas of commonality for other people, not so much spill the beans on yourself. I think that a lot of confessional poets, for instance, are misnamed. They don't tell everything. They don't confess everything, but they tell certain things that then pull on strings in us, if you like. And so I hope that I try to actually make that space you're talking about, because what it's supposed to provoke in people is a recognition of where they themselves may have experienced that kind of disenfranchised grief. I think that's probably a very common experience, and it's not spoken about. Whether it's somebody you weren't supposed to know, or somebody that was your best friend's partner or something, and they die and you feel grief, it feels inappropriate next to the closer people's grief. So hopefully a lot of people can relate to that across the poems in that book, if not in this initial poem, which is kind of introductory, and wanted to introduce the notion of the journey by sort of starting with that. But I think that space is really important to kind of be oblique. It's that, going back to what you were saying, like with Dickens and the tell it slant. If you tell everything, there's less for the reader to do with it. And why should it be interesting to them? You're just one person among millions. Whereas if you can, as I try to, find the elements that other people may connect with, and then introduce a strangeness as well that isn't their experience. Because when you read, you don't just want to see your own experience reflected. You want to see oddities of how other people have experienced and perceived things too. At least that's true for me. It's those knotty bits, those bits that are a bit different, that make me keep reading a poem. not
Yep.
the bits that look just like my experience. So it sounds contradictory, but you know what I mean? You want a tension between the two. So you know what this experience is, but here's a weirdness in it that's different from what you might expect, hopefully.
Well, there's got to be some work for a reader to do.
Yeah. And that's what I assume people want if they're reading poetry. Now, if you're writing prose, maybe you have, or an essay, then you have a different set of conventions of what you expect the reader to do. But I think poetry has always been about that participatory thing where the reader comes in and does at least half the work, if not more.
Yeah, I mean, there's a kind of three-way relationship. There's a poet and the poem, and then the poem and the reader. And there's really a direct relationship between the poet and the reader.
Yes. And it's always really fascinating to hear back what people get from a poem, even and especially when it's the completely unrelated to what you had in mind. Then you think, wow, that's incredible that language can do that, I never find that as a misreading. I actually find that as the most productive and useful things.
Yeah, it's the ambiguity, explain the ambiguity that different ways of seeing the world tease out of a poem.
Yes.
All right, I'm going to ambush you with a couple of final questions, Tracy.
Yes.
Why do you write poetry, and what does poetry mean to you?
Okay, they're big questions.
I know.
I always wrote poetry because I didn't feel like I had a choice about it. So because some things that you have to deal with or process aren't processable in any other way. I think that's really the simple answer. So it's also because I love to read it, and because I loved to read it from the time I was small, even if it was just nursery rhymes. I think that really sets you up to love poetry because you've got that music of words. So that's why it's a way of processing that nothing else quite does. And maybe if I could paint or if I could make music, maybe that would do that for me. But you do what you can, don't you? And what was the other one? What does it mean to me?
Yeah.
Is that the question? Well, I guess one thing I already said was it seems to occupy the space that was meant to be occupied by spiritual things for me in the way I was raised. So, that I don't mean that to sound sacrilegious. I don't mean it to offend people by saying I've replaced God with poetry. I don't mean that at all. I just mean that element of contemplation and interior exploration, the interior life, it's to be found in reading people's poetry. And indeed, a lot of the great spiritual scriptures are poetry as well. So, in more than one tradition. So that sounds very grandiose, but that's actually what it is. It's not, it can be entertainment, but it's not just. It's something that fulfills a need that nothing else does. I'll always read poems. There's no doubt about that. And, they'll never stop. There'll always be more poems. That's the other exciting thing. There's always a new generation of people writing poetry that see things differently. And I love that, and do things differently,
Yeah. Fabulous.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much, Tracy, for sharing your poems and
a pleasure.
And exploring your experiences, thoughts, and insights on the theme of transience. I'm feeling quite transient myself now, but I'm hoping that Poets Corner continues in perpetuity. Details of Tracy's books and where to get them will be posted with this podcast, so look out for that. Next up on Poets Corner will be David Brooks, reading poems and talking on the theme of animals, the open, and the compulsion to poetry. See you then.